The over-application of the 7-year rule could mean that records are destroyed too early, but some organizations go to the other extreme, refusing to ever destroy any records at all. They may even point to legal requirements to keep records forever without consulting the legislation itself. If they did check the actual laws, they might be surprised. For example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of the United States does not say that you have to keep records forever. It does contain retention periods for specific records, such as 5 years for audit working papers. There's a clear mandate to actually destroy those records in particular, as opposed to simply keeping everything forever. Some organizations refer to privacy laws as a reason to retain records forever, but most of those laws discourage retaining personal information any longer than is absolutely necessary. Other organizations have a vague impression that their particular industry is subject to specialized regulations requiring permanent records retention. But if you read those regulations carefully and apply them to actual files, you might find retention periods which are fairly long but do have an endpoint. Many laws contain limitation periods which might go as high as 15, 20, or 30 years. Others specify retention periods that might not begin until long after a record is created. For example, a regulation might authorize disposal of engineering files 2 years after a facility is decommissioned, but that same facility and associated records might remain active for decades. Even then, the retention period will eventually come to an end. One final point relates to the term permanent record. While that phrase may appear in laws, regulations, and industry standards, it does not always mean that the record must be retained until the end of time. In some cases, permanent record may simply mean an official file which is protected from further alteration or deletion. Other sections of the same law, regulation, or standard might prescribe a finite retention period for that record. Never assume. Always read the entire law and make sure you get the full story. TAB's recommended solution to minimizing permanent retention is very similar to that described for 7-year retention. Again, the emphasis is on careful documented research of applicable statutes, regulations, and operational requirements. The first step is to identify explicit, direct requirements to retain specific records for a given period of time. Map each requirement to relevant records categories, taking special care not to apply requirements too loosely or broadly. For each category, review the different requirements applied to it. What is the longest retention period contained in those requirements? You should also be careful in applying some of the longer limitation periods. Working with legal counsel and other subject matter experts, apply basic principles of risk-benefit analysis to each category. How likely is it that records in the category would be relevant to legal action? What is the possible impact of not having the records if legal action were to occur? Does the likelihood or impact of the risk outweigh the costs and practical considerations associated with long-term storage? You should be equally careful in identifying operational needs to keep records. By all means, consult record users, but do not assign retention periods based on knee-jerk responses about how long records are useful. Instead, look for concrete business processes and actual precedents that show a real specific need. Finally, give some thought to what retention periods mean for personal information. Why was personal information collected in the first place? How long does your organization really need to retain the information in order to perform work consistent with that purpose? The only acceptable reason to keep the personal information longer than needed is to meet any other direct legal requirements. If no such requirements apply, then you definitely should not keep the information forever. Our fourth and final records retention myth relates to the concept of archival records. This term is sometimes misunderstood and over-applied. The goal of an archival program is to preserve records for generations. This means protecting them against deterioration and damage, which can be caused by everything from excess light to rodents to large-scale disasters. The physical, technical, and environmental controls that go into preserving archival records can get very expensive, especially if you apply the archival label too widely. Given this challenge, it is very important to note that not every old record is an archival record. We see the same principle with antiques and collectibles. A 100-year-old coin is worth little more than its face value if there are thousands just like it in circulation. It has to be rare or historically significant in order to be valuable. In the same sense, a very old record may not have historical or other significance for your organization, especially if you have boxes and boxes of very similar records. The key is to have specific criteria for what your organization considers archival. Otherwise, your program may become a dumping ground for outdated material just because someone finds it quaint or interesting. In order to apply archival resources selectively, you need a clear mandate to only accept and preserve material which meets certain defined criteria. This mandate can be provided by an archival retention policy, archival acquisition strategy, or other governance tool. The policy or strategy should lay out in concrete, specific terms what constitutes archival value. Some of the content which gives records archival value include evidence of corporate organizational development, such as its initial founding, major mergers and acquisitions, or restructuring. Significant milestones, successes, and other events which help represent the growing image and character of the organization. Legal and business precedents that might inform future actions long after legal liability has passed. Activities or events which provide evidence of the organization's relationship with external groups and communities. Anything which shows the organization's role in broader history. Did the organization help settle a community, build infrastructure, or so on? The field of archival science has evolved a number of selection strategies, appraisal techniques, and sampling methods. You might consider adding these to your toolbox depending on how robust a program you're able to develop. This ends Part 3 of 4 of Records Retention in the Real World.